I have a term that I call the central climate conundrum. It may seem impossible to imagine that the most technologically advanced and sophisticated civilization in history, or so we think of ourselves, could collectively choose in essence to destroy itself. But that is what we are now in the process of doing. We are unprepared to make the necessary changes to our societies to restore a safe climate, and yet we're also unprepared to even acknowledge the consequences of not making those changes.
Welcome. I'm Dale Walkinen, and this is Facing Future. What words best describe our times? The age of fossil fuels, the Pleistocene, the polycrisis, or possibly the ultimate human folly? Changing conditions have created a language that often needs translation if we are to adequately communicate the urgency of the climate and other crises. Whether you are a planetarian or perhaps an apocalyptimist, you may not be totally clear on the meaning of, say, climate sensitivity, Arctic amplification, global stocktake, tipping points, positive feedback loops, NDCs, aerosols, albedo. Confused? Fortunately, our good friend Herb Simmons has created a glossary, a climate vocabulary for the future, which is a welcome reference book to help us muddle through these troubling times. Kim Stanley Robinson described it as a wonderful achievement, a science poem, an inspiration, a prophecy, often hilarious. Dive in and see. Herb's own background is quite eclectic. He studied at the London School of Economics and has degrees from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania and from the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University. Herb's been a county administrator, a city manager. He taught politics and urban planning at Stockton University and the New Jersey Institute of Technology, and he opened a wellness center in Washington, D.C. He's the host of Climate Emergency Forum, and I'm delighted to say that he's agreed to co-host some of our programs. So welcome, Herb.
Well, thank you, and thanks for that kind introduction. I'm a little ambivalent about having you indicate that Kim Stanley Robinson said the book is hilarious because that puts a certain amount of pressure on me to be hilarious. But but notwithstanding that, thank you for those kind words, and happy to be here and eager to talk about the book.
Okay, yes, for sure. But before we dive into it, it'd be great to hear how you were led to create this compendium of both ingeniously invented and very crucial concepts that might define our future. Want to
Well,
tell us?
Dale, I always had this habit of defacing books. Usually they were mine, as opposed to library books, where I would read a book, usually nonfiction, but sometimes fiction books, and I realized that the author was trying, in a paragraph or two, to explain some idea, and I thought, where's the word for that idea, or the term, or the two words? So I would often scribble a term that I thought might reflect what that author meant. And I've done that for years and years. And as I started getting involved in climate, I realized something that anybody who looks closely at climate realizes, which is that it affects everything and that we don't always have the right terms because it is a new concept to convey the meaning in ways that are effective and interesting to people. So I sort of combined my perception that climate needed a sort of a revised vocabulary or a new vocabulary, along with just the fact that I really enjoy doing that kind of work. And as a side benefit, since I've been working more or less, on climate full time in various capacities for a decade, doing this book was so much fun that it took away some of the echo sort of phobia, the solastalgia, the anxiety, the concern that I think many of us who deal with climate every day feel.
I think it's helped us. It's helped me when I read your book. I felt
Oh,
like,
well, that's good to
okay,
hear.
this is, yeah, it was very cathartic in a way, and also it is humorous. You don't have to worry about being humorous. You just naturally are, and it cheers you up in some strange way.
Thanks. Yes, I'll second the strange because I'm not even sure exactly how it cheers me up as well. But thank you for that, Dale.
There are so many terms that we fling around and we talk about climate, and people really just don't understand what we're talking about. It's become so, before you wrote this book, I thought somebody needs to really write a definition of all these terms for us so that people can just understand what goes on at COP and what people are saying. And people don't even know what is COP, a stupid term that is, of all things.
Yeah, I
So,
mean that's right.
tell us.
Instead of council or conference of the parties, why not just say it's the annual climate meeting, the world climate meeting of or yeah. Anyway, there's so many more examples. I have a couple in there that have well, there's one that has an acronym that has something like 15 different letters. That's an unpronounceable acronym and has to do with contraction and convergence. That rich countries should contract their
Uh-huh.
emissions, while poor countries should increase their emissions in order to be able to meet their human needs. But the actual term has a 15 letter, at least it did when I wrote the book, acronym. So yes, a little insane.
Right. Well, people will have to get your book and dive in there to see what that term is now that you've tempted us. So tell us, you were going to read a little bit of the introduction you wrote to what will be happening in 2035 or looking backwards from 2035, not only 9 years from now. So do you want to read some of that?
Sure. Let me. It's about 20 pages, so don't worry, viewer. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the arc is kind of the things are grim at the beginning, and then there's sort of green shoots of progress that are made looking back from a decade from now, and ultimately at the end of this sort of scenario, we're really on the pathway to effectively addressing the climate crisis. So again, don't expect this to flow that well because I'm reading from different sections, but just to give you a flavor. So here we go. It's 2035. A collective, albeit tentative sigh of relief could be heard from the 8 billion souls and their surviving biotic brethren. Climate misconception, pregnancy peril, and eco anxiety were key reasons why the population is still 8 billion even after 12 years. The bioclimatic emergency caused by the twin ecological and climate crises have clearly peaked. Everyday life is characterized by a kind of punctuated disequilibrium, intense intervals of all but unbearable chaos, broken only by intense intervals of all but unbearable chaos. The disaster denialism, so common and so destructive in earlier years, was swept away as rapidly as the beneficent beach bungalows owned by millionaire megalo moguls. Mortality cost of carbon calculations concluded that one person died from the carbon emitted by every 250 Americans. Malignant normality, perhaps best described is best described the utopian nature of everyday life for most. Climate grief focused as much on the loss of order and stability as it did on the loss of property and light. Guilt per gallon was pervasive, even as electric vehicles, e-bikes, and other forms of vehicle micro immobility took over. The lost art of walking still had not gained a firm foothold. The cryosphere, the icy part of the Earth, saw the accelerating loss of glaciers at the third pole and at such enormous ice ecosystems as East and West Antarctica and Greenland. 500,000 tons of ice are thawing as you hear me read this paragraph. That's right, 500,000 tons of ice. Pathogenic
Well, the
air.
cryosphere
Yeah.
is already going down at an alarming rate. It's hard for me to imagine that there would still be 8 billion people on this planet if the cryosphere continues to disappear at the rate it's going. So, indeed, you are an apocalyptimist. We should define that term. It's such a good one.
Yeah, it's sort of that an apoco. The first part is apoco, meaning we think everything's going to go to shit, and everything's going to be okay. Which I think is part of the human mind that we can hold oftentimes very contradictory thoughts at the same time. Sometimes with discomfort and sometimes with ease. Um,
Yep.
so,
I mean, I think
yeah.
we're all doing that. We're all doing that because otherwise you can't live your life. It's just so terrifying and dark, and the people around you are not in that state of mind anyway. So you drift back and forth between what you're looking at and what's around you at the moment, which is perhaps not as terrible as what's coming. Anyway, please
Okay,
read
couple
on.
more. Yeah, just a couple more. Comfort rationing, that's one of the terms I enjoyed writing, is now the practice of governments most everywhere, as they have the thankless task of balancing the resources available to enhance people's comfort with the need to ration energy. Um, Cliffs, the sea cliffs that we see, what I call cliff crumbles, crackled, cackled, and crunched into the night, serenading a sonic soliloquy for many miles, particularly along the English and the California coasts. The climatification of so many landscapes turned felicitous, fecund fields, forests, and fjords into barren, bare, and bald badlands.
Oh
Wow, I
my
can't
goodness,
believe
alliteration.
I actually read that without making too many stumbles. Can't believe that. Um, then let's see here, just picking up a few sort of as we go on to the sort of more positive part. What I call Gen C, the climate generation, turn the tide. The popular Climate One program allocated 1% of all taxes into public awareness programs. Asia Learns Climate was the name of a program that reached students in every corner of the continent and was soon emulated throughout the planet. Climataria, kind of like planetariums, but devoted to exploring what climate looks like, were built in hundreds of cities, bringing multimedia immersive experiences guided by the best in climate science and Hollywood entertainment. Fast fashion morphed into slow fashion, with clothing purchases falling sharply as fashion shaming led to the BTO campaign, buy two once. All were encouraged to buy more than two sets of clothing and to keep them there. Most people had been guilty of what's called carbon profile. I can't pronounce that word. Profit. Excuse me. As keeping as most people keep at least 12 sets of clothing. These clothing buyers often reformed only after a stint at a 12-step unfashionable program there. Um,
Well, I'm going to stop you there again.
yes,
Fast fashion is huge as a problem. In fact, clothing accounts for more carbon pollution than all of the transportation combined, including planes, trains. It's enormous because, of course, we all wear clothes, and we wear a lot of clothes, and we throw away a lot of clothes, and they wind up in landfills, and it's just an incredibly destructive process, almost rivaling the plastic, which is
yeah.
another completely
And,
horrible
and
process.
in some cases, they're made with plastic,
Yes,
microplastic. So you can't,
exactly.
really can't even, like so much with climate and ecology, hard to separate things. But that's why I wanted to emphasize clothing because it is forgotten. And that then I sort of go on to say that experience was an epidemic of what the author Elizabeth Rush describes in her wonderful book, End Sickness. Things we are not equipped to understand, time periods we don't usually grapple with, catastrophic events we have no reference for. That's what she calls end sickness. And then I call it an echocolia epidemic. It eased through the widespread use of climadelic therapy, actually using psychedelics, which have a remarkable track record now, or beginning to show people to reduce anxiety, to give optimism, and so forth. There,
Well, a large portion of the population is now on various kind of mental health uh, medication because people, if they're at least bit aware of it, are terrified. And if they're not aware of it, they're just, flying around the world and doing whatever they want to do. And it's a mixture of psyches that are trying to deal with various realities, various concepts of realities. We're not all looking at the reality that's there. We're all looking at the reality of our own minds, how we perceive it. And it's our job as climate communicators to try to find ways into those mindsets that will be effective for that person. Not an easy job at all.
in fact, I think maybe the most difficult question I'm occasionally asked or that I ask others is how does one communicate climate change to young people in a way that it doesn't mislead them, on the other hand doesn't exacerbate or create a level of anxiety that would be understandable. And it seems to me that getting away from the book, that one of the real challenges is for those who have the kind of expertise in that to talk to parents, to talk to schools, to talk to the media, because I think it's sort of self-evident how challenging the problem is. And as I think Dale, and many of our viewers, there are international surveys that are really eye-opening, if not frightening, showing an extremely high percentage of young people all over the world, have some degree of climate anxiety or whatever we want to call it. And that's now. That's, imagine in a decade or two, and what that means to one's personal ability to function, but also the ability of society to function in a reasonably healthy manner.
Yeah, well, I'd like to talk about some of the terms in your book because there are
Sure.
some really interesting um, concepts, some things that you've created, which I think are quite amusing, and others that are things we need to describe. For example, who knows what a global stock take is? What kind of sense does that make? It's like COP, what kind of word is that? What's a global stock take?
Well, global stocktake was the theory behind the Paris Agreement, which we would set these targets, the international target of trying to keep to well below 2 degrees C, which that seems to be going out the rear window. And unlike the Kyoto Agreement, this was intended to be and is an entirely voluntary agreement on the part of almost 200 nations. But the idea is that each few years, in this case every 5 years, the countries would come together and take stock. How are we doing? Learn from each other, hopefully have peer pressure. If your neighboring countries are doing better than you are, maybe you'll feel the pressure to ratchet up your commitments and your action. That's the theory. The practice, unfortunately, hasn't borne out that the stock take has led to much ratcheting, and we're on target even if countries meet all their emission commitments of going well over 2 degrees, maybe as much as 3 or more. Nobody knows in the coming decades, which will likely activate multiple climate tipping points. That's a whole other story. But that's essentially the idea behind, which I think was a valid approach.
Yeah,
Certainly
sure, it was a good idea.
in our own lives, we should take
Yeah.
stock every now and then and say, how am I doing? Or ask your family or your friends, how am I doing? Did I meet my goals? And that's all this was intended to be.
Yeah. Well, that's also the NDC. What is it? NDC? The
Oh, yeah.
Nationally Determined Contribution, which
Yeah.
is what they theoretically were going to do, and I don't think anybody has done.
Well, that's a perfect example of these sort of absurd words, because when I wrote the first edition of the book, it had another letter. It was the INDC, the intended.
It's,
And I wrote in my first version, I think something like, why don't they just say the National Climate Plan? I mean, because that's essentially what they're asking each country to do: come up with a plan. Instead, it's INDCs. So, I guess if we're going to be saved, it will have to be through a bureaucratic language. So I'm doing my tiny little bit to try to address that, and others are as well.
well, another thing they say is climate ambition, which is another one of those cop terms that comes up a lot. Um, But one of the things that we're on the brink of is whether or not we're going to use aerosols or marine cloud brightening or ion fertilization, various types of geoengineering as things start to exponentially, and it will be exponential. It's not a straight change. People will probably resort to these things, and there's all kinds of controversy about it. I think marine cloud brightening is one of the better ideas, especially say over the Arctic, where if we don't lose that, if we lose the cryosphere, people don't realize how important that's our cooling system for the Earth. All of that cryosphere itself. Okay, there's another term.
Well, actually, I came up with a term that a group I'm involved with has adopted as a kind of umbrella term for marine cloud brightening or stratospheric aerosol injection. The initials are DCC, direct climate cooling. So the emphasis on what results from it as opposed to the technique. In other words, somebody might think, well, why should we brighten clouds? It's to directly cool the climate, stabilize, and bring down temperatures. But if I could, I wanted to just mention maybe one or two terms that I particularly enjoyed. Well, for whatever
Sure.
reason. So
Please.
here's one that I call bird BBB, bird brain brilliance. So zebra finches, and of course finches is a type of bird uh, that laid eggs when temperatures were higher than 78 degrees Fahrenheit. They sang a different tune to their unborn chicks than were sung to other eggs when temperatures were lower. As a result, the chicks that were born after experiencing these special songs were smaller and thus they were better able to cool down. Speaking of cooling, to cool down, enabling them to adapt to higher temperatures. Just imagine that. And then my sort of the end of that um, entry says it appears that finches are adapting to climate change better and faster and more brilliantly than humanity is. So, who are the real bird brains?
Oh dear, we do know what the answer to that one is.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, yeah.
Another one is, um, I think, by just mentioning the name will induce certain images that people may not prefer to think about. A carbonoscopy, a proposed device or mechanism that can examine machinery or systems to help minimize their carbon emissions. While the process may not be as physically unpleasant as a colonoscopy, the results can be equally significant in discovering what I call carbon cancers that need to be resected. And here's another one that I call the carbon sirens. So I think most of it remember from school. Ulysses in Homer's Odyssey was so tempted by the allure of the sirens that he had to order his crew to restrain him from being in contact with them. Today's carbon is our siren, both enticing and addictive. We have yet to find a way to ignore her charms. Can we find our modern version of Ulysses' army to restrain us from continuing to experience the delights of our own carbon sirens? The future of the Earth may well depend upon that.
The carbon cycle is what really defines the climate. If you look back through the geological record, you see that when there was a lot of carbon 3 million years ago, like we're getting to again, it was hot. And when the carbon weathered, and because it weathers as it rains it comes into the limestone, and then the carbon goes down and the planet cools. And these kinds of cycles have happened many times in our past. We would be heading toward an ice age, but we've so heated the climate that we are not. Carbon is necessary for life. Carbon is not a carbon dioxide is critical for plants, but too much of it, it's the devil's in the dosage.
And then I have a term that I call the central climate conundrum. It may seem impossible to imagine that the most technologically advanced and sophisticated civilization in history, or so we think of ourselves, could collectively choose, in essence, to destroy itself. But that is what we are now in the process of doing. We are unprepared to make the necessary changes to our societies to restore a safe climate, and yet we're also unprepared to even acknowledge the consequences of not making those changes. That is the central climate conundrum that I certainly have no answer to. But
Well, this is our double think, one foot in each kind of reality that we can't imagine. We can sooner imagine, the I don't know, other catastrophes than the whole climate collapsing. We can't imagine that. If the stock market collapses, we can panic. But with our whole life system collapses, hello, people.
yeah,
But that's where it's so hard to, people are learning new terms: bomb cyclone, bobogenesis, atmospheric river, and these things are filtering into the culture, and we're kind of say, okay, that was an atmospheric river. We heard of that before.
I have
Um,
about 12 or 13 such terms that, and if I was this was written 2 years ago. If I was writing it today, that there would be 3 or 4 additional. About every year, there's another 2 or 3 new terms to characterize aspects of the climate that we've never seen or had reason to label that way because they were so rare or unusual or unheard. I wanted to mention one other that's not, some of the others were, maybe people think they're kind of a little cute or whatever, but one of the things I think that doesn't get much attention, if at all, is a term that I created, a very simple term called the climate microbiome. And I'll read the first paragraph of this entry. A warning from scientists in 2019 put humanity on notice that the impact of climate change will depend heavily on responses by microorganisms, which are essential for achieving an environmentally sustainable future. The statement, quote, this comes from a statement by many scientists, puts humanity on notice that the microscopic majority can no longer be the unseen elephant in the room. Whatever you might think of those mixed metaphors, end of quote. If microorganisms aren't considered effectively, it means models cannot be generated properly and predictions could be inaccurate, says Professor Calviuccioli, one of 30 signers of the warning. Mm-hmm. The more we know about the planetary microbiome, the more we see it as a kind of microbiomic hegemony, sort of running things. And so these scientists have given us a warning. It's the little guys that we can't see or feel that will affect our climate in the long term as much as the big pictures, the airplanes we fly and all the rest of that. And that's, of course, that represents one of the extraordinary challenges of climate change because it does affect everything and it is affected by everything. And you need an army of scientists, not only to do the research, but then to work together in a coordinated way in an interdisciplinary approach, which is not how science or our knowledge base is organized right now.
Well, the United States, of course, has fallen way behind. Scientists tell me, they can't even communicate with their colleagues in the United States because we've shut down NOAA, all this horrible stuff that's happening. But yes, I mean, coming back to the microbiome, the insects, what you call the shifting baseline syndrome, which is what the general perception of each generation is. When we were kids, there were lots of bugs on the window shield. That's the famous part of it when you drove around. And now there aren't. Or there were a lot of butterflies in the garden, and now there aren't. And the generation that comes into the world doesn't think there should be a lot of butterflies, but the generation that was leaving thinks, what happened to the butterflies?
That's right. And nobody's been able to figure out how to overcome that, quote, shifting baseline syndrome, and yet it leads to a kind of normalcy for things that should not be normalized. I think it's as simple as that at one level. We get used to something, we get used to an extreme, and it becomes the new baseline of our behavior, and ultimately those extremes will and could do us in. It reminds me also of another term that I think everybody watching knows, Bill McKibben. And he said something that really struck me, something really simple. He said, we are running Genesis backwards. We are decreating, not creating, we are decreating. And so we live in a world of decreation, and rather than the world of it has all sorts of consequences. Another term, this gets back to the bird brain brilliance with the finch singing it a certain way in certain temperatures. I coined the term diminutive destiny, and that is that heat leads to shrinkage in both humans and other creatures. The world may have reached a so-called high points in the size of living creatures a few years ago. Evidence is mounting that this shrinkage is already occurring in creatures as diverse as bumblebees, fish, birds, and many animals. There's no reason to believe that Homo sapiens will be able to escape it. In fact, average height in the United States is already shrinking, with the world leading in the shrinkage of the height of our residents. And of course, that's not just due to climate change, it's due to all sorts of social ills. But that's our destiny, a diminutive one, both in terms of literally how high we are and also in so many other respects.
Well, of course, the climate crisis is only one of the poly crises that are around us, the pollution, the abuse of fertilizers, the animal agriculture, which is creating the destruction of rainforests. All of this is intertwined. The amount of poison, you go into a store and the amount of poison that's available to people is really shocking. And we're pouring that all on our poor planet, which does not really enjoy these kind of poisons. We use it for cleaning, we use it for growing things,
That's why that's why
yeah.
I came up with the term, or I mean, it's been used, but not exactly in this context. But I think we all should use it, or something like it, which is the bioclimactic crisis. They're intertwined, they overlap, they reinforce each other, and if you only look at one, you're not going to be able to solve either. You've got to find ways to deal with the biological collapse, the ecological collapse, the climate collapse, and how they work together. And what results, if we don't, is another term. This is not an original term for mine, and some of you may have heard of it. It's not a happy term. It's called the extinction obituary. And if I could quote, you're looking at that last individual, knowing that when that individual will die, as it inevitably would, that would be the end of that long evolutionary history. It's a scar on our conscience. So said a conservation ranger in 2014 about an animal called the forest skink, which is a lizard that went extinct in 2014. And then I go on to say, a funeral for the Ojokul Glacier in Iceland included this plaque, and this was just in 2019, a letter to the future. OK, as they call it. OK is the first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier. In the next 200 years, all of our glaciers are expected to follow the same path. This monument is to acknowledge that we know what is happening and what needs to be done. Only you will know if we did it.
Oh, yes, the obituary for a glacier. Well, on that happy note, I think we'll close out our discussion here. And I think perhaps people want to, as you say, create their own little glossary for themselves and define the terms that are surrounding us. With a bit of humor goes a long way, and I appreciate your sense of humor and your spirit in maintaining, your sanity across what's happening to the
Well,
world.
well,
So
at
thank you.
least some of the time I do, and I'd like to really encourage those who are watching today. If you have an idea for a new term or a comment on one of the terms in the book or that I've mentioned today, I will ask Dale to leave my email address in the chat. Please don't hesitate to write to me. Tell me what you like, what you don't like, what you'd like to see in the. I'm slowly beginning to put together terms for the next edition, and this will be a much more effective effort if it involves a whole lot of other people like those who are regular and loyal watchers of Facing Future. So thank you, Dale, for inviting me.
Great.
I look forward, I hope, to co-hosting some future programs with you, and we'll move forward.
Okay, sounds good. I will put your email address in the description. I'm very brave of you to put it there. We'll see what people probably will want to contribute. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.